So Brandon and I are going to tag team this. It's going to be a little bit of a tennis match. We're just going to kind of go back and forth every other slide, but the main topic here is really about optimizing grazing cattle, particularly cow-calf performance, and how Summit can play a role in that, particularly at certain times of the year. This really goes a long way into explaining hopefully how ruminants and kind of the ruminant nutrition approach to things is maybe a little bit different, obviously, than monogastrics. And if we do a really good job of really focusing on rumen function first, then that will about 90% of the time take care of the animal. So it's a little bit different approach to the way we would do things typically. And so we'll try to unpack that a little bit here as we go to hopefully provide some understanding.
Yeah, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So first thing we're going to cover is just some of the key nutrients in order of importance to beef cows, right? So number one is water. Water is used for everything from growth and production. That means like reproduction, lactation, fat deposition, all the way down to just lubrication of joints, right? It also plays a role in regulation of heat. Without water, you can have energy, you can have protein, you can feed the animal as much stuff as you want. If they don't have enough water, they're just going to die, right? So water is the number one nutrient that we need. Followed up by energy. Energy is basically just the fuel for growth and production. So this is what gives the animal the ability to grow, reproduce, lactate, all that kind of stuff. In beef cows, we typically measure this in TDN. And TDN stands for total digestible nutrients, and we'll kind of dive into that a little bit later in this presentation. Next is the protein. That's protein, amino acids, however you want to refer to it as. Protein's kind of unique with ruminants, right? So we have a protein requirement for the actual cow, but protein also plays a major role in rumen function and how the microbes kind of do their job. So there's kind of two facets of protein in a ruminant animal. So there's that microbial protein idea, or the nitrogen that's going to be helping with rumen function, and then there's also the protein that's actually going to help the animal to grow and produce tissue growth and things like that. And we'll dive way into that on this presentation, I think, too. So followed up by minerals and vitamins. So these are things like calcium, phosphorus, zinc, copper, and then obviously vitamins A, D, and E. These play a big role in enzymatic processes, metabolic processes, immune function. They're important for growth, lactation, reproduction. So yep, that's kind of the order of importance of these nutrients, and we'll kind of hit on all these throughout this presentation.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate something that Brandon said there. When we talk about a cow, that she's out grazing forage, right? Energy is everything, right? They're not in a feed yard getting fed corn or what I'm saying. Their energy is everything for these cows. And so this is really why we talk about microbial catalysts a lot, right? And why that's such an important product to really drive digestibility and intake and increase energy to these cows. So just kind of want to emphasize that, and that's going to really be kind of an underlying key concept here of what we're going to talk about. So we'll talk a little bit about, and I forgot I had these transitions on here, Brandon, so hopefully we'll get this figured out here. But we'll kind of just talk about protein here in a couple of forms. I'm just going to probably try to get them all loaded up here. It's confusing me. So really there's kind of three types of protein that we talk about in ruminants. And if we just think about total protein or consumable protein, we can break that down into two categories. One would be degradable, or we call that RDP, and that's the protein that's going to be utilized in the rumen by the microbes there. Or there's undegradable, or RUP, undegradable protein, that really bypasses the rumen and can be utilized directly by the animal. So we're always trying to balance these two kind of things. And really, for our intents and purposes, 90% of the time with cattle, we're mainly concerned about degradable protein, right? Because if we do a good job of feeding the bacteria and the other microbes, then they're going to do a pretty good job of taking care of the animal. There's some exceptions to that, but for most of what we do, that's going to be important. And the reason why that is that if we do provide those adequate amounts of degradable protein, then we're going to increase microbial protein, right? And so that's just, the amount of bacteria. They're obviously like 80% protein. So as they die, as they reproduce and die, and they flow on down into the small intestine, then these bacteria actually get utilized, and they're very high quality protein. So we really can't provide the animal with a more better amino acid profile or quality of protein than we get with the microbial protein. So that, yeah, already said that. Okay, Brandon?
Yep. So energy, you kind of hit on it earlier, but total digestible nutrients, so TDN, that's a big player when you're talking about cows. What this number is basically it directly relates to the digestible energy available. So when you look at like a feed analysis and you see a TDN number, the higher the number, the more energy is available to that animal. This TDN value really works on high forage diets. So when you're talking about grazing animals, cows, we really use TDN. That's kind of how we measure energy in cows. But in growing animals like feedlot cattle, TDN is usually not the number that we use. To Jeff's point earlier, this energy factor is the key thing for cows to basically do what they're supposed to do throughout their life cycle, which is get bred, have a calf, lactate, right? We need all that energy. That's what we fight for in a grazing system is energy in order to make that cow be very successful for our operation.
Okay, so take notes on this slide because there's going to be a quiz at the end. And this is going to be an answer, one of the answers to the questions, right? So if you take anything away from this presentation today, this is key, right? And so really when we talk about this rumen environment, right, trying to balance these two components of protein and energy, this is what we want to do. We want to be in balance, right? We want to have enough nitrogen or protein for the bacteria to adequately utilize the energy that's available to them at any given time. And so the way you know that is if you take your TDN number, so let's just say that it's 50% TDN diet, and if there was 10% protein, then that would be a 5, right? It'd be a 5 ratio. And so what we're looking for is 8 or less, ideally. We'll talk a little bit about that, but if we get above 8, then what that really means is we have more energy available to the animal than they can really utilize, right? Because the bacteria are limited by nitrogen. So even though the energy is there in the form of this fiber, if the bacteria don't digest the fiber, then the animal's not going to. So we're really missing an opportunity here. And so as anytime this ratio becomes greater than 8, that means there's more energy theoretically available to that animal. It's just not going to be broken down because the bacteria have a nitrogen or protein deficiency, right? So this is really going to be a key thing. So just remember 8 is really the ideal. And as we go above 8, then there's going to be an opportunity here where we can supplement some really strategically some nitrogen. And I keep using this word nitrogen because you're going to see here as we go along, the bacteria don't really need protein. They don't need intact amino acids. They can get by with just simple nitrogen sources like urea or other non-protein nitrogen sources for the most part. So it really is about nitrogen and a little bit less about amino acids as we relate specifically to the ruminant environment.
Yeah, so the key question we're really trying to answer in this presentation or give you the information is when should you supplement a forage, right? So if you have cows out there grazing a pasture, when is the right time to supplement that forage with a protein source, with an energy source, timing, what type of protein source? Jeff just mentioned NPN or actual intact amino acid proteins, which protein supplement is going to work best at different times in different situations. And that's really the bulk of the questions that we're going to try to answer throughout the rest of this presentation. So.
Okay, so again, we talked about this idea that the animal's requirements are essentially being met by 2 different sources of protein. One, the bypass protein coming from the feed, which is the minority, right? I want everybody to understand that's not a significant part of the diet. The 80–90+% of their requirements are going to be met by these microbial protein sources, right? And so we want to do everything we can to really optimize or maximize that. And so microbial protein production, this is where it gets a little interesting, is really a function of energy, right? So as we increase the energy to the animal, that's going to drive microbial protein. And in fact, you can calculate that number simply by taking the TDN number and multiplying it by a factor called microbial efficiency. And that efficiency is going to be in the range of 10 to 13%. It's going to be lower for like lower quality diets, say forage, and it's going to be higher for like higher quality diets, like say a feed yard diet where we're feeding a lot of corn. So, but again, within that range, if you ever want to just guess at it, just use 11%, and that'll get you pretty close most of the time. And then the big thing, and you're going to see this a lot here this morning, this all assumes that there's adequate nitrogen, right? So nitrogen's not limiting, not protein, just nitrogen's not limiting. And then if we don't have a limitation on nitrogen, the more energy we put into the system, the more protein we get out.
Yeah, so what this basically shows is just a visual of what Jeff just said, right? So this is showing basically as TDN goes up, microbial protein provided to the animal goes up with it. And again, that's under that assumption that Jeff just said, nitrogen is not limited in the rumen. So if we have adequate nitrogen in the rumen, the more TDN, the more microbial protein. And this is why cows can kind of take advantage of forages where, or ruminants, I guess, can take advantage of forages where other digestive systems just can't do it, right? Because they can get a lot of microbial protein from these energy sources of forages. And when you look at this, it's pretty impressive, right? So at a 65 TDN forage or diet, they're producing 2.2 pounds of microbial protein. That's like feeding basically 4 to 4.5 pounds of soybean meal to an animal, assuming like a 45 to 48% protein soybean meal, right? So that's pretty amazing. That's a lot of mass that they're getting just from microbial protein. So this is another really, really important thing to understand, that we can basically feed the animal protein without really feeding them protein, right? We can increase protein to the animal by just increasing the amount of energy that we're giving to them as well. So.
Okay, so we're going to kind of move into some real life examples here. This will go pretty quick, but this is just some numbers I pulled together years ago, just looking at live in Kansas, obviously. And so we have a lot of tall grass prairie around here. And so I had access to some numbers. So I just plotted these by season. So 1 is January, and out here 12 would be December. This would just be what, on average, the TDN and protein, these are percent basis, right, looks like throughout the course of the year, right? So this by itself really doesn't say a whole lot, but it's going to be used kind of in the background as we move forward here.
Yep. So this is a slide very similar to what Jeff just showed, but instead of showing you the difference between TDN and protein, it actually shows you where that TDN to protein ratio falls throughout the year. So again, 1 is January, 12 is December, and then the side numbers there are your ratio of TDN to crude protein. And what this really shows us is what time should we be supplementing some sort of protein supplementation, NPN, whatever it may be. But it really is that January to maybe mid-March, April timeframe. You supplement protein, then bring back again right around August to the end of the year. So those are the times where we're probably going to have some sort of protein supplementation out there to bring back down that TDN to crude protein ratio to allow that animal to really utilize the energy that's out there for them. So.
Yeah, and I just want to give a reminder here that this is just based on that one forage, right? So every forage, every different type of region can be different based on growing season. So it's always good to kind of understand where you're at with this and just calculate these out. But this would give you an example of where we would expect to see improvements in animal energy and body condition score, milk production, etc., just due to some nitrogen supplementation. The other point I would make here, just real quick, is that we don't really need to feed corn to cattle when this ratio is below it. This is just really an indicator that we have a lot of extra nitrogen and that you could throw some extra energy at these cattle and really not have any impact on forage digestibility. And I'll touch on that here a little bit later. So if we take that kind of previous diagram and we overlay that with, or actually if we just look at forage, we'll look at the animal's requirement. Okay, so this is this black line here, right? So this is a cow that's calving kind of in this March, April time period. So you can see the requirement going up for nitrogen or protein or energy at the same time. They're going to be really on top of each other. So that's going to go up, due to lactation, and it's going to kind of fall back down and, around weaning. And then it's going to start to build back up through the last trimester of pregnancy. And so really what this is showing is microbial protein in yellow, and then the amount of undergradable protein that would also be in the forage, right? So that's actually going to be utilized by the animal and not by the bacteria. And so if you stack those two bars together, that's going to be the total protein supply to the animal. And so you can see that almost every month, with the exception of just a couple, the bacteria can actually, and the forage can meet this animal's protein requirement, and actually goes in excess at times, right? So again, just this idea that if we do a good job of taking care of the rumen and the organisms there, they're going to pretty well be able to take care of the animal from a protein perspective. Now, this is for cows, right? We're getting ready to see an example where that doesn't meet that. So then again, just point out that in these scenarios where we would have nitrogen deficiencies, if we can correct those with something like extender, an easy free choice mineral that can deliver nitrogen, then really we can just rely on the animal or the rumen, the bacteria, to take care of the animal.
Yeah, so this is showing the same thing that Jeff just showed, but instead of for a cow, it's just for a growing animal. So think like stocker cattle, a steer that's a 5 to 6 weight steer trying to put on weight. And again, this is just in one scenario using this tall grass prairie, so this doesn't apply to maybe the whole country or every region, but in this one area, this is showing us that we really can't meet the protein requirements for that animal through just microbial protein and the UIP in the forage. So what you would have to do here, extender is not going to help here with just adding nitrogen to the rumen. You would be wanting to supplement some sort of protein source that's going to bring in some more UIP that can get to that animal. So that would be some sort of like organic type protein, like soybean meal, distillers, cottonseed meal, something like that, to really help provide more protein than what's available to the animal, instead of just adding a nitrogen source to the rumen.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a busy slide, but this is really the idea that we're talking about. So these are the ratios that we've been talking about, right? So obviously, as we're below 8, we have excess nitrogen relative to the amount of energy that's available in the forage. So you can see intake is really high, right? As we start to approach 8, it's going to start to come down, and this is expressed as a percent of body weight. If we continue to go below 8, you can see what happens to forage intake, right? It's just going to continue to go down, right? And the reason for that is the bacteria just aren't able to digest the forage, so it's just kind of balling up in the rumen, right? They're not able to get it out of their system, so they can't replace it with more feed, right? And really intake is going to drive energy consumption, and energy is everything, like we've talked about. So this idea here is that if we come in here and we start to make up this deficiency, so this line here, protein supplementation is going to maintain that intake across these lower quality diets, right? So even though it's not super high in quality, we can still maintain intake, and that intake is going to help maintain the total energy to the animal. So again, not that it's often done, but if we were up here where we have excess nitrogen, you think about wheat pasture or maybe some type of improved forage, or really any forage when it's really first growing, when it's really green, there is an opportunity here, especially if maybe we're behind. We've got some body condition score challenges. We need to put a little extra energy into these cows. You could feed straight corn to these animals when you're in this ratio and really not have any negative impact on the forage, right? They'll continue to eat grass and digest it just fine. And we'll talk a little bit more. I got one other slide here. I'll kind of try to drive that point home with a little bit here in a second.
Yeah, so this is just kind of another way to show what Jeff was talking about. So again, you got to look at a scenario of the energy to nitrogen balance. There's an imbalance between energy and nitrogen, right? So we're above that 8-to-1 TDN to crude protein ratio in this scenario. And what we're seeing here is that when we supplement soybean meal, we see a rise in both digestibility and hay intake. So just by adding a little bit of nitrogen to that rumen, we're able to increase digestibility, which then in turn increases the intake. And it's pretty substantial, right? So if you only do a half a pound of soybean meal, you're upping your hay intake by almost 2 pounds, and you're upping your digestibility by almost 7 percentage points. So you see a pretty big response on protein supplementation. As far as energy goes, energy available to the animal, right? So if we add more protein, again, we add more energy. That's kind of like a theme throughout this presentation, right? So.
Yep. So this just kind of showing the same thing. There's lots of research here really to validate this point. A thing I would point out here, particularly in cattle on lower quality forages or grazing applications, is that typically our response and intake is going to be greater than our response in digestibility, right? But the reality is, to the animal, you're going to multiply these numbers together, right? So think about it like you're getting more energy out of the feed and they're eating more feed at the same time, right? So it's a multiplicative or a totally associative response, right? So it's really important concept that, you know, some really targeted, strategic, and fairly low levels of nitrogen or protein can really go a long way in helping these cows utilize their forage and put on, you know, increase energy and put on body condition score and produce milk and do all things we want them to do.
And this just kind of shows that response and performance, right? So, you know, as Jeff said, if we add that nitrogen into the rumen and supplement it with a little bit of nitrogen to get that increase in intake and increase in digestibility, it multiplies itself to a pretty large increase in overall energy consumption. And this just shows it, right? So cattle that were not supplemented an RDP protein source, you know, lost 11 pounds, and the ones that were supplemented gained 85. That's pretty remarkable by just adding a little bit of nitrogen to the rumen, right? And then to that point too, you know, it may not look like a lot in the graph, but adding, you know, basically 0.39 pounds of average daily gain to a calf adds up to about 80 pounds on a 205 adjusted weaning weight. So it's you know, that's a pretty substantial difference in performance for both the cow and its ability to basically grow a calf.
Yeah, just as a reference point, to everybody, this difference in body weight is a full body condition score, right? There's about 100 pounds between a body condition score. And so this is the difference between an animal being in a body condition score 4 and 5 or 5 versus 6. And again, 80 pounds of weaning weight is nothing to you know, to dismiss either. So again, a lot of very significant changes here that are really tied up in these principles.
And also, I guess to add to that, a whole body point or a whole body score or body condition score point could be the difference between getting a cow rebred or having her open the next year. So
yeah, good point. So this is a slide I've been kind of hinting to, and it really speaks to really what is it we're trying to do, right? So this is just going to represent the digestibility of forage. So if we do nothing, right, we're just going to start off here at 50% digestibility, right? If we feed something, and again, obviously, because we have this response, what this is telling us is we have a situation where we have an inverted ratio, right? We have that above 8 type of a ratio, right? So if that's the case, and we feed something less than 15% crude protein, let's just call it corn, right? It could be other things, but let's just call it corn. Then we're actually going to decrease further digestibility, right? And this is what we've all been taught and heard, you know, is, oh, well, you can't feed corn to cows on grass because, you know, we're going to decrease forage digestibility. And the answer to that is correct, right? The reason why, I think, is misinterpreted, right? Most people would think that, well, it's because we have forage digesters and we have starch digesters and we shift the population of the rumen microbes. And while there is some truth to that, the bigger issue here is we suck all the nitrogen out, right? So corn's going to be easier to digest than is hay, right, is fiber. And so if we're in a negative ratio or we have this above 8 ratio and we put more energy into the system, i.e. corn, then we're going to suck more nitrogen out and there's going to be less available to digest the forage, right? So then if we go to this kind of 15 to 20%, it's basically neutral, right? So what we're saying here is we can get more energy to the animal, right, without negatively impacting digestibility. So this is kind of a neutral situation, right? So again, you can kind of keep a rule of thumb is always just use 20% protein, right? And we make, you know, a lot of the industry is built around a 20% range cube, right? So the idea behind that is that we can put extra energy into the animal, into the system, and not negatively impact forage. Now, as we get up over 30% protein in our supplement, now we're actually having a positive, right? So now we're actually putting more nitrogen into the system than we're putting energy. And so now we're having that effect on increasing digestibility. So this is really kind of an important slide to understand, depending on where it is that you're at, right? If you don't have forage and you want to substitute forage, then corn's great, right? If you have plenty of forage and you're just behind on your cows a little bit and you want to put some energy into the system, then a 20% protein type product is going to really be ideal. If we have lots of forage and we, you know, the cows are in good shape, we don't need to gain anything necessarily in any short time, and we just want to get the maximum utilization of our forage, then we want to be sure we're supplementing with something that's greater than 30% protein.
Yeah, so just kind of a summary of what we've gone over today is, you know, maintaining the nutritional balance is very important, especially when you're talking about that TD and the crude protein ratio. You know, that 8-to-1 ratio, as Jeff said earlier in that first slide of with a scale, right? That's if you take away anything from this, understand that TDN to crude protein ratio should be an 8-to-1. Anything higher than that, you're going to see a decrease in intake, a decrease in energy utilization. Also, it's important to understand that microbes can't supply the majority of protein needs to the cow, right? So if we take care of the rumen, we take care of the microbes in the rumen, they'll take care of the cow most of the time as far as protein requirement goes. And then as we mentioned here before, if you feed protein, it can increase energy in the animal. So you can basically increase energy by increasing protein, and vice versa. You can increase protein supply to the animal by feeding more energy. I guess one caveat to all of the system, and Jeff kind of mentioned that last slide, is that these concepts are only viable if forage supplies are not limited, right? So if you have plenty of pasture to graze, if you have plenty of hay that you have left for the year to feed, these concepts apply to you. If you're in a drought situation, if you're overstocking, these concepts don't necessarily apply to that situation.
Sorry, Brandon, I got a little, I got a little
No,
excited.
you're fine.
So this is where we're going to kind of wrap up here with really, where we started with Extender, right? So what is Extender? It's a free choice mineral supplement that delivers an effective amount of protein. Actually, it's 80% protein, right? For those that aren't aware, so it's a significant amount. And it's really going to be really targeted at bringing these TDN to crude protein ratios down to 8 or close to 8, with the idea of increasing digestibility, increasing forage intake, and ultimately increasing energy and microbial protein supply to the animal.
Yeah, and some of the features in it, it's basically Summit Prevail, but instead of feeding a 4-ounce mineral, it's a half a pound per head per day. And that's just to get enough adequate protein into them to shift that ratio. It has IntelliBond trace minerals for zinc and copper. So we took out those sulfates that could have a negative impact on forage digestibility. It contains cattle-zyme. We've targeted that salt level to really achieve a consistent intake. The macro minerals are delivered at appropriate rates. So that's your calcium, your phosphorus, your magnesium. We're not underfeeding those. We're not overfeeding them. They're right where they should be for the majority of forages. And there is no added potassium, which that is a player in this, but we won't get into that too much today. We'll dive into that one day on another more mineral focused talk.
Yeah. So the protein side of this is it's a blend of natural protein, predominantly soybean meal, and biuret. Biuret, for those that maybe don't know, is a slow release non-protein nitrogen. It's basically a polyurea, and it's an extensive commercial usage in North America since the 60s, and it is approved for both beef cattle and lactating dairy cattle.
Yep. And when Jeff says it's a slow release, it's just kind of a visual of that. So if you look at this graph, biuret is kind of releasing rumen ammonia. That's kind of how we measure this is through the rumen ammonia, but it releases that rumen ammonia similar to soybean meal, right? Whereas urea, you see that huge spike in rumen ammonia when they've been infused with urea. And one bad thing about that, and this is kind of why we can feed this free choice, is because it doesn't get that huge spike in ammonia with urea, feeding that free choice, you could have these big spikes in ammonia, and if they overeat it, that ammonia can actually become overwhelming to the rumen and cause toxicity issues and eventually lead to death. But with biuret, we don't see that huge spike, and that's why it's safer to feed free choice.
Yep, you would never feed urea free choice to a range cattle animal. It's too risky. So this is the same thing. We won't dwell on it, but this is really the proof's in the pudding. This is actually looking at the blood urea nitrogen, which is ultimately what's going to cause the issue. So again, we're seeing the same thing with urea spikes, pretty high. But your biuret and soybean meal being basically very similar on top of each other in terms of blood urea nitrogen level over time.